Friends, and welcome to a new episode of Reality Check. Our age is dominated by the ephemeral and the transient. Cultural deconstruction runs rampant, and a looming nihilism seems to engulf all meaning and existence itself. Yet the transcendent still manages to break through. Here at Reality Check, we inquire how to conserve the real in a time of deconstruction. In this, our time, modern art emphasizes often the ugly, the controversial, and the provocative, while the enduring beauty of classical masterpieces offers a powerful antidote. The rediscovery of the profound connection between beauty, art, and faith allows us to explore how the timeless elegance of historical works can inspire and uplift the human spirit. By delving into the rich heritage of classical art, we find a renewed appreciation for the divine and the beautiful, reminding us of the transformative power of art in our lives. With this in mind, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Leff, a luminary in the field of art history whose passion for Italian Renaissance and Baroque is unparalleled. Leff studied art history at the University of Chicago and further honed her experience with a master's degree from the University of Bologna. Her profound understanding of the Italian Renaissance and Baroque has been shaped by her extensive research and years living in Rome, where she is sitting today, and the cradle of the artistic movements there. She's not just an academic, but also a gifted communicator and tour guide, and also a prolific author. So her two books, The Tigress of Forli and How Catholic Art Saved the Faith, are bestsellers, and we will tackle those today. She has made numerous appearances also on television and international conferences, sharing her insights on masterpieces and the historical contexts that shaped them. So without further ado, Dr. Elizabeth Leff, Liz, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jan. It's very nice to be here.
Now, I just recently watched your TED Talk again. So I used to watch it regularly before I went into the Sistine Chapel myself, on the Sistine Chapel, which I also highly recommend to the audience. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How and when your love for art was sparked? And why did you end up living in Rome?
Well, I think I've always been attracted to mythology, history, and as a result, those things are beautifully illustrated in art. And so it really became a natural outpouring of a way to think of these great stories or to learn about people and historical periods through images. And so it seems to have been, I was very fortunate that the affinity somehow clicked very early on as I was still in high school. And so I was able to pursue studies in art history at the University of Chicago. And then later, when I went on to do graduate work at the University of Bologna, my topic for my thesis was in Rome. And so it's sort of constant going back and forth transformed what had originally been to me a dirty, rather horrendous city to really a place that, like Queen Christina of Sweden, it seemed like I couldn't live another day if I didn't live it in Rome. And so it's now over 25 years that I made the leap to the Eternal City, and for better and for worse, I'm very happy that I did.
When you studied art history, was your interest sparked by more modern works or contemporary works, or immediately were you drawn to more classical, let's say Renaissance, Baroque paintings and architecture?
So I think for me, it's always been figurative because it's about stories and it's about people and it's about history. And so for me, I think at the end of the day, I've always been it'll be a figurative work that gets my attention, which means that will take us to works that range in kind of the Renaissance period in Italy. I was very interested in neoclassicism in France, the Romantics in France. I mean, that kind of is what usually catches my attention. When I was working, however, when I was studying in Bologna, I was not. The way I feel about modern art now, I think is a lot more honed than the way I felt about it then. I remember being sort of interested in this world of modern art. I remember writing a paper on pop art and really kind of just understanding it for a moment. There's the Roy Lichtenstein and the Andy Warhol made sense to me. So there was a thing about modern art that I wasn't really hostile to it. It's over the years that as I've gotten more interested in religious art, I have more of a problem of trying to reconcile an art that is not figurative with with the incarnational.
This is, I think, one of the issues of modern and contemporary art in general, right, is to what kind of sacred art does it produce? And oftentimes that is really, it seems to me to be the threshold really of what sacred art has to be. Sacred art has to be figurative because precisely of the incarnation and the characteristic of particularly the Christian faith where God becomes man, right? He takes on the flesh. So would you share that opinion?
I would say for the most part, I'm sort of thinking in the back of my head, are there exceptions to this? Probably. And there are probably beautiful ways of evoking the presence of the spirit, the idea of Genesis. There may be ways of doing that that are not figurative, not obviously something I feel like becoming a specialist in, but I think taking into account, and I think this is one of the more important elements, that yes, I can see a way for there to be an art that's not figurative, that can represent these deep spiritual effects of the soul. The problem I have is that if art is trying to communicate to an audience which is beyond remedial in their understanding of what we believe, I mean, you could start with the Nicene Creed, work your way through Scripture, go down to the Catechism. I mean, when we're dealing with something very remedial, I'm not entirely sure that an art that presumes a lot of knowledge is really helping to contribute to the work of evangelization. And that really is, at the end of the day, what we are supposed to do. We are supposed to go forth and bring all nations. It's just and I don't think that's going to work with an art that makes it difficult that most people can't understand.
Well, what I find interesting is, and this is how I explain it to my students as well, if a work of art needs, a page of explanation that is put all next to it, well, in a certain way, there's a lack of communication in the work of art itself, right? Because to a certain degree, it has to be self-explanatory. And my experience in Rome was that even if I look at, let's say, a mythological scene, right, that I may not be familiar with, it's just a bunch of people in the forest, effectively, I can still enjoy the beauty of, well, a bunch of people being in the forest. And then when I know the story behind it and, the gods that are walking and that are presented there, and maybe even the artistic touch of the particular artist, then it just enriches my understanding. It gives me deeper and more layers of reference, of understanding. But even without that specific knowledge, I can still appreciate it for its beauty. And I find that that's an important feature to remember when we look at art. What would you think?
I think that's an important distinction, because at the end of the day, all works of art that are based on some sort of representation of a story does actually have somewhere around there's a page of explanation. There's an explanation of the myth of Sisyphus. There's an explanation of the story of Noli Me Tangere. There's always an explanation. The difference, as you rightly point out, is when you have to read the manifesto of the artist, and this to me is always a sign that art was heading off the rails. When you have to read the manifesto of the artist and understand all the things the artist wants to communicate about the horrible things in the world and what needs to be addressed and blah, 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 blah. And then you can look at the work. At this point, I mean, then it's not really art anymore. It's just chatter with an illustration. And so the as you say before, you could at least make out things. You could get intrigued. I wonder what those people are doing. Actually, I'd kind of like to find out what that story is. Why is that? What is the tension between that woman and that man in a tomb? And why is he wearing a gardener's hat? And that curiosity might actually bring us to getting around to reading the story behind it, or the actual scripture. So yes, I think that's a very good distinction.
Have you had the same experience when you have your own students in Rome, that they click more with the figurative art rather than with the abstract? Or what has been your experience with their reaction like?
Yes, we've just waded into problematic territory. I would say up until a few years ago, There were these wonderful moments at the Galleria Borghese when you walk them around the Apollo and Daphne or the Pluto and Persephone. You're telling the story and you can see it click in their minds. But now I begin to wonder more if we are in an age where the students find it more congenial to go with, we at Duquesne offer a little modern art weekend to go look at modern art, which is so much more subjective. It's an art of, like I feel, I think, this is my reaction, this is what's happening. It's an art that is in many ways much more approachable. It doesn't require so much understanding. You don't have to go and read the myth, and you don't have to go think about the technique and all these different things that seem to be overly demanding on the part of students. So, I mean, my last few batches of students have been a little more attracted to things that were easier. So, works of art that are just simply, feelings or color or sensation or drama or protest, with a lot less appreciation for really, it takes a lot of work to make a work of art, and it does take work to appreciate a work of art. So, yeah.
I remember very fondly the tours and the explanations that I've been on with you. And I mean, you do have a very remarkable gift to bring these things to life. But the way, like, I never felt that having the lack of the knowledge of understanding the work really was a hindrance, was an obstacle to appreciate it in the way that you explain it. And I think you start from a very basic, very kind of, basic standpoint in a certain way. But can you walk us through that a little bit? So when you explain, let's say, a statue by Bernini, where do you actually start with the explanation, and how do you conceive of your explanation to bring this work of art, and kind of have it touch the audience? Like, what's your modus operandi?
Well, I think it varies from work to work. It depends, first of all, what is the piece of information that will serve as a hook, right? What's gonna actually click in people's minds? So you can, in some cases, it may be a little fact about the artist. You might start with the artist himself. So when you're looking at Gian Lorenzo Bernini, for example, the Aeneas and Anchises is the first time he's going to be pulling, the first time he gets a block of stone, and he's going to have to take three figures out of the block. So usually the way a sculpture is already complicated because of the fact that you have to have a piece of marble that is taller than it is wide, and then you have to figure out how to make the single figure balance. What happens when your first public work is or your first major commission is going to be one figure, and then he has to carry another figure. I mean, so you start out with the real challenge. Like, how did Bernini address this challenge? Or you start out with the story. In the case of Pluto and Persephone, this is a story that, it's a long, involved story, and it involves, deceptions and mistakes and et cetera, et cetera. And so at the end of that story, it's a substantial piece of information. And then the question is, well, you've got a piece of stone. How much of that story are you going to be able to tell? Like, what are you going to choose here? Which moment of the story do you choose? So we enter in the artist's conundrum of how to select the moment in this rather long affair, how to select that moment. So it sometimes it involves the technique. Sometimes it involves starting with the story. Sometimes it still involves starting with the artist, but it's really kind of selecting the card that it seems like the people in front of you are going to appreciate, or, in the case of trying to think about, what is the overall overarching point I'm trying to make in an essay, in a book, and what is the aspect of this work? Why did I choose this work as an example, and sort of bringing that out?
Do you ever get bored explaining the same works of art over and over again?
No, because you're never explaining it to the same people.
All right.
So it's never really the same explanation. And it's always interesting to look at people and try to understand, how can I convey this information to you. And in all honesty, and I think your listeners will be aware of this, our ability to retain and to pay attention has diminished greatly in the 25 years I've been doing tours. And the amount of information that I could give people, and I could rely on people knowing, has diminished intensely. And so it's also a very interesting challenge in the back of my head at all times. I'm thinking about, okay, I'm going to put this piece of information in this part of the tour. I'm going to need it later on. I wonder if they're still going to have it. And so then a lot of the times it probably sounds a bit cynical, but that's not how I feel about it. I use a lot of these tours to experiment in, if I say something to people 4 times in 4 different ways, and then we get to the Sistine Chapel. My favorite is the side walls of the Sistine Chapel, which, as you know, Jan, were painted by a team of painters working for Sixtus IV. None of them were Michelangelo. Michelangelo was only 5 years old, and they were painted by Botticelli and Perugino. So during the course of a tour, I will point out that the side walls were executed when Michelangelo was 5. There was no way he could have painted. He's good. He's not that good. I will use the term the dream team of Florentine art, thinking that maybe a catchy little name will be in there. I will point out that Michelangelo's painting teacher was one of the earlier painters who worked there. So it must have been really weird for Michelangelo to be standing up on the scaffolding on top of the painting by his master when he slept through fresco class. It must be a kind of like, oops, perhaps I shouldn't have slept through class. And then I will usually point out that Botticelli put in portraits of the future Pope Julius II, and that Perugino was originally supposed to paint the upstairs. So that's 5 different ways I have alluded to the side walls of the Sistine Chapel as being paintings that were produced by artists that are not Michelangelo. And yet I will walk into the Sistine Chapel and people look at me and they go, so Michelangelo painted everything, right? He painted the sidewall, right? So, I mean, first of all, that's not, even looking, we spend hours looking at art. And so this is how Michelangelo paints, this is how other people paint. So it's a very interesting revelation to me about how people are visually processing things and how people are retaining information even during the relatively short time of, an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours in a tour. And so this is, no, it doesn't get boring because it gets depressing. But it doesn't get boring because I'm always thinking, what can I try now? What can I do now? What shall I do this time? Is there a way? And when it succeeds, then I'm always very excited, of course.
Very good. Yeah, I feel the people that are on your tour are very blessed for having that kind of also intuitive and well, I guess pedagogical approach from their guide. The tool what I was often confronted with myself while giving tours, but also explaining the art even to students, and this is in the classroom or on site, is basically like a twofold criticism. And I would like to just share that and see what your reaction would be. One is that, and this is more the standard I feel that everybody has when they come to Rome, well, that the whole artistic work that we have collected in the Vatican and, well, in all of Rome, obviously, with its many hundred churches and the artwork contained therein, is basically just, made by the elites as propaganda for, to deceive the masses, right? And to I guess touch up on the very shady history of the Catholic Church. So I've heard that in its different varieties over and over again. That's one criticism. The other criticism that I oftentimes heard, and this is a little bit more nuanced, and I guess comes mostly from younger people, is that these classical figurative works of art are quite elitist. They can't be understood. This alludes more to what you said in the beginning. They cannot be understood by everybody and by the by the common mass, because they're too complex. They require too much education, and so they're by a small coterie of elite for a small coterie of elite, which obviously are it's a criticism that refutes itself. As Chesterton points out, like you cannot do both at the same time. But I've heard both of these criticisms often and repeated. So how would you tackle that? How would you tackle those two arguments?
Nonsense. It's ridiculous, both of them. I mean, the argument that it's made by elites for elites. I mean, yes, the Sistine Chapel was made by elites for elites. Yes, that one is true. That's my whole point. We started and said, don't think you're going to be able to understand it right away. It was made by people who don't need their Bible stories reminded them. It's a whole different ballgame. St. Peter was built for every single person on the planet. It's open every a.m. to 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. It didn't charge a ticket until the cardinals started getting clever. But the fact of the matter is that it's technically free. What is elite about that? What is elite about creating a space where people walk in and their jaws drop and they're amazed and their hearts beat faster and they see something amazing? What's elite about that? And then the idea that figurative is elite because you have to understand the story. What could be more elitist than non-representational contemporary art, where you have this blue bubble and you have to go read something written by one guy because he was in this mood in order to understand it? That is elitist art. Works of art that are produced so they can be shared among hedge fund owners so that they can create a little investment fund. That is elitist. You want to see elitist. Elitist is the art you're looking at right now. Elitist is an art that is ugly. When they make something that looks like excrement and they tell you that it's beautiful because they want it, because they think the world is excrement, because they want to be able to be so powerful to be able to look to convince other people that ugly is beautiful. That is elitism. Absolutely. So good thing I don't have an opinion on the subject.
Very good. There's fascinating. I'm sure that you're aware of him, obviously. There's a fascinating new documentary on Tom Wolfe called Radical Wolf. I highly recommend it. I just recently watched it on accident. Well, I found it on accident. It was actually available on one of the planes that I took this summer, and it's a really great documentary. But Tom Wolfe has a fantastic way of satirically showing the ridiculousness of contemporary painting, specifically after Picasso, and then in architecture, which I'm just rereading the book from Bauhaus to My House, how the whole architectural, elitist group, coterie, really, came over from Europe and basically single-handedly destroyed all kinds of American realism or revivalism or any kind of romanticism or classical approach that was there, and that still is the paradigm, I guess, of today. But Wolf has a very good way of dealing with these kind of ridiculous nuances, I think, that you also now brought up. So worth watching. You're familiar with him, I'm sure.
Yes, I'm trying to remember the name of that book. He wrote a very small, very funny book about funny, depressing book. It was a very small book. It's specifically about contemporary art. I can't remember. I'm blanking on the name, which is age. But yes, and it was what?
The Painted Word.
The Painted Word is in the eye. Was the Painted Word. That was it. Yes, that was a remarkable, remarkable book. And he really caught. He caught that element of this modern art that seeks to really hoodwink people in many ways.
I do have two of your books here. So the more recent one is How Catholic Art Saved the Faith. And I would like to speak just a little bit about this. We don't have to go into all of the details. I highly recommend it, as everybody can imagine. But what was the idea behind this book? It has a very strong, very persuasive argument. But how did this come about? Was this something that you had planned, or did this come about while you were, researching for all of the art tours that you were doing? What's the story behind
it? Really, this is this is the work I've been doing since I went to Bologna. It's basically not exactly the subject of my thesis, but my thesis brought me into the realm of Counter-Reformation art. And it brought me into some of the characters of the Counter-Reformation era, including Gabriele Pagliotti and St. Charles Borromeo and the Carracci School, and this world of painting. And in Bologna, which is really one of the great galvanizing forces for the revival of art. They were very, very proud, so much so that Bologna La Rossa, the Bologna the communist, kind of put aside the communist thing in order to be rah-rah about this moment of the church. So it's a very interesting dichotomy that I had at a school that was very, very the communist administration forever while I was there. But at the same time, it was a school that was very committed to the idea of this individual terroir and the very particular terroir that Bologna had had over the course of the years. And then I came to Rome and I started teaching at Duquesne University, and I started teaching a class on Baroque art. And the more that I was trying to find a way to explain to the students this Baroque period and its theatricality and its mixed media and its and the various things that define the Baroque, the more I began to realize that its roots are really in the Counter-Reformation, that everything I'm talking about, particularly started in architecture, everything I'm talking about were things that were already discussed and thought about during the late 16th century. But in the 17th century, what happened is that the artists kind of internalized all this information so that they became much more creative. I think of it often, I used to explain it to the students, it's like learning to dance. And so this early Counter-Reformation, you can still kind of see them standing a little stiffly and counting out the steps as they're dancing. But there comes that point when you know all the moves and you're able to do that, you internalize it so much that no one can see the counting and the actual steps, and you just see the flourishes. And the Baroque really, its foundation is in this Counter-Reformation aspect. And then the other thing that fascinated me about the Counter-Reformation is that, so I have these sort of two voices that are coming at me. In Anglo-Saxon literature, when we read about the Counter-Reformation, we always hear about this attempt on the part of the church post-Council of Trent in 1564 to destroy art, that the Jesuits wanted to destroy art, that the church wanted to destroy art, that they wanted to put a stranglehold on art, that they hated creativity, and blah, 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 blah. At the same time, when do we start getting professional female artists? Counter-Reformation. Who's helping them? Churchmen. Caravaggio, who never would have been able to get a job at the time of Michelangelo and Raphael, never. He would have been dropped immediately, suddenly is lionized by Philip Neri, and not Philip Neri personally, but the gang of Philip Neri. This period is looking for communicators, and they don't care who you are. They're going to give a man like Caravaggio a chance. They're going to give women a chance. This is a raped woman whose reputation was in tatters, like Artemisia Gentileschi, becomes a voice. And so this is a thrilling period. And it turns out, so this catches my attention. And then trying to teach this incredible volume of works to students, there had to be a kind of structure. I kept thinking, like, there must be a way in which these make sense, and we can classify these works so that the students will be able to understand what we're looking at, instead of just like work, painting, sculpture, in which case it's just like a laundry list. And it began to occur to me, especially when you're looking at these works in situ, like where they're supposed to be, that many of these works are simply Eucharistic. They are there to help us understand the real presence in the Mass. I mean, that's there for that. Or they're there for us to understand the spiritual experiences of the saints. Or they're there to understand the presence of our guardian angels. And that's how the book began to take shape. And the more I worked in this vein, the more these works, they all fit into these categories. It worked. And so it was a great, really fun book to write. I wrote it for so I finally got the whole thing together for the anniversary of the anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. It was 2017 when I started working on it. And it just began to occur to me how many things in our contemporary society are really looking an awful lot like things did in 1517. And so I wanted to talk about how in that period, the church's response was to really bring forth beauty. So they just unleashed this incredible amount of beauty on the world and carried the day.
That's very beautiful. Would you say that the Baroque is the last time in the West where all of the disciplines of art work together in a fruitful way?
Well, the last time in religious art, I would say that film does it very well. today. So the art form film brings together all the different art forms in a very brilliant way. There were there are some interesting kind of installation ideas that happen um, in the early 20th century. But insofar as religious art, it's the last time I think the church is really sitting on top of the church is the leader in the game. And as of the 18th century, the church is no longer the leader in the game. And by the time you get to the 18th century, the church is out of the picture. And by the time the church re-enters in the late 19th century, the 20th century, when the church re-enters the game, it's in the 20th century, and the language has changed. And just everything has changed. And I don't really think the Catholic Church has recovered from that yet.
One of the paradigms I feel where the different disciplines of art can still work together in unison is the liturgy. That seems to be in a sense, because that's where you need music, that's where you need movement, which ultimately could be said is dance. There you have the representation, right? You have the vestments, so you have different types of art within an architectural context. So I like to point that out. I like what you say about film, because I make that point often, that that's really Gesamtkunstwerk, because it does have music, it does have right motion, it does have colors, it does have light, it uses all of these elements. But the liturgy, I feel like that could be a focal point again, and was always, but could be a focal point where the church maybe takes leadership again. But obviously it's a specifically sacred paradigm, whereas then it's a question, how does it translate to the secular world? So I don't know.
No, I think you're right. The liturgy is really the liturgy with a capital L, comes into it really. Yes, of course, you're right. It's the most beautiful way that we've ever successfully blended everything into one truly moving experience.
One of the elements that you said, and I want to lead this a little bit further, but you say the church was the leading voice. Now that's very interesting. And you said that the church has lost that and has not recovered it. Do you see that it could become again the leading voice? And I tell you why I ask that question. Oftentimes, when I'm teaching students about classical art and figurative art, the Renaissance, the Baroque, which intrinsically are touching in a way to everybody. But all right, that's a different question. And students are wondering, and they say, well, that doesn't exist anymore. There are no artists that do that. And that's actually not true. There is actually a bunch of artists in Italy, in the United States, architects, sculptors, painters. They do exist. So,
France.
Yeah. So what's your?
No, they're artists all over the place. No, there are yes, there are a lot of artists out there. No, you're absolutely right. That's not what the problem is. The problem is patronage. So the sort of, to go back to the question, the church could be a leader again. So the church has been a leader in art on many different occasions. However, there are moments when the church was not. And as a matter of fact, one of the great impeti of the sort of high Renaissance wasn't so much the action of the church; it was the action of lay people who really started, being very interested in commissioning art. The Franciscans and the Dominicans, these religious orders, were key figures. Benedictines were hugely important figures at one point or another. The Jesuits, in their own right, they were very important for church architecture. So we do have the religious orders, but we also have a lot of work on the part of lay people. The church itself, the Catholic Church writ large, they tended, with the exception of Julius II, who just had a nose, which was incredible, they generally kind of picked people that they already saw were successful, which is really the MO of the church. And I think it's its prerogative. I mean, the Catholic Church, its best move is, instead of being a training ground for people who have to figure out what they're doing, it's a good thing for them to kind of wait to see who the cream of the crop is, and then they take that and they give them possibility to express themselves in a way they wouldn't be able to do it in a normal context of patronage. So I don't, and I don't think the Vatican should be getting into the weeds of artistic patronage. I do think lay people need to. And lay people, we talk about the hour of the lady, and lay people want to do all kinds of stuff. But if lay people, want to be a big deal in the church, but then they don't want to bring it home with them, if they don't want to create a situation where artists are competing and you can attract the best artists because, hey, there's a whole niche out there. I could become a religious artist and there'll be people falling all over me. That will pull people away from painting haystacks or their puppy dogs or whatever it is that people do. Squiggles. They seem to like squiggles. And they will actually start applying that to a place where there is a market and people who are interested and people who are dialoguing, people who are exchanging. But that is something that requires, there are a whole lot more lay people than there are of clergy. And if we see these clergy, first of all, the first thing that happens if a clergyman starts spending money on a painting, poor, I mean, this immediately hoisted. So no, we can't be looking to the clergy. We love the idea of the clergy helping to form artists. We love the idea of the clergy being supportive, but we should not be sitting around twiddling our thumbs waiting for Cardinal such and such to buy works of art. That's not, I mean, we are past the age of the Cardinal and Farnese and the wealthiest man on the planet. We don't have those cardinals anymore. They can support us spiritually. They can support us in formation. They can come up with ideas of where we can put these works of art. They can do a million things, but it's up to us to be buying that art. It's up to us to create a competitive field for artists.
That's a really good point. The idea of patronage, and that's oftentimes what I feel is misunderstood. Is the church does not have to found in like an artist workshop where the artist has to learn it. That's skilled labor, and that needs to be done by professionals who do it right in the proper way as it has always been done. But those artists and those workshops that already exist can be, as you say, can be picked up and can be supported, and then ultimately also the commissions can be given because churches are being built, right? Churches are being renovated. We had this recently at the Oxford Oratory. It's fantastic. They realized, hey, there is actually the life of Saint Aloysius underneath, green veneer that was painted over during one of the renovations. And they said, okay, so they got some, well, I mean, they're not artists, but still they're, art specialists, and to scrape it off and to give the church its, in this particular part, it's back its original glory. So where there's a will, there's a way, I feel. And that's also true for the revival of art. So then would you say that this is the single most important feature for reintroducing beauty into art is patronage from the side of the church?
Yes, people have to demand beauty. They have to demand it. Because right now, everything about beauty has been undermined over and over and over again. We are presented with the ugly and told it is truth. So no longer is beauty, beautiful, truth, and good all together. We find truth and ugliness. And we're told that's where we should look, as if we are the only period in the history of humanity that has difficulties, that has suffering, that has cruelty, that has murder, that has senselessness. The people who have lived in the people who lived in the dirt when they built Gothic cathedrals, the people who lived during the plague when they painted these extraordinary ceilings, these people managed to rise above. But we just tell each other, no, there's no reason to, let's just wallow in the misery that is the human condition. What a ridiculous notion. I don't need to see it in a work of art. I know the misery of the human condition. We're all human. We're all sinners. We all live in our own muck. Therefore, what we look for in art is something that shows us a way out, reminds us that we're more than people think more than our own sinfulness. We are infused with something that's meant to make us great. And that's the role of art. And we have to remind people, we don't want that. I'm not going to buy that from you. I don't want to see your unmade bed with your pills and your problems. I'm not interested. Yes, I've got problems too, but I don't want to look at that. I don't want to look at your shark in formaldehyde. I know that I'm going to die. I know that that's going to happen. I want to think about death in another way. I don't want to hear it from you. Find me an artist that will tell me something that makes me feel like my life is worth living. That's what we have to do.
Do you feel that that was the driving force for many of the great artists that we admire and study today?
They all have different driving forces. Fra Angelico truly was a man who picked up a brush and said a prayer. He would preach through painting. That's what he did every time he picked up a brush. Caravaggio struggled. And I really believe that light and dark contrast is so resonant to us in this particular age through that grittiness that he speaks to us in the depths of a man who clearly could not get his act together, but could see this light and could see the direction. And that as much as it made him suffer to see this is what I'm supposed to be, he never brought the tenor down and said, well, then we don't want that light anymore. We're just going to shine the light on the horrible and make that look like it's the most beautiful thing. So Caravaggio is, I think, particularly important artist for our day and age. And I think that's why in the 20th century, there's been this big revival after he got forgotten about for 200 years. I think Michelangelo, there's an issue between how much of the work was done in honor of Michelangelo and how much of the work was done in honor of God. I mean, at the beginning, Michelangelo clearly has this incredible affinity with the spiritual, but we also see that Michelangelo pushes himself because he's very interested in earthly fame, and trying to balance that is a very important part of the career of an artist of a caliber like Michelangelo. Raphael loved art. Raphael just loved art. I think if you asked him to sculpt out of mashed potatoes, he would have found a way. It's for him, the idea of producing something, that creativity, the problem, and always trying to take things and make them beautiful and elegant and orderly. I think for him, that was a huge satisfaction in his life. And the list goes on and on.
Very good. Very, very good. Yeah, that's that's a very hopeful tone. Also to end on, just as a maybe as a closing question, this is another book that I have for you. This is actually your first one, as far as I remember, The
Aww.
Tigers of. Now, do tell us something about this beautiful lady.
Oh, yes, I get sentimental every time I see her. I loved writing that book. And I found out how hard book writing was when I wrote it. I thought of it as making perfume, hours and hours and hours in a library just to be able to write one sentence. She is to me fascinating because where a lot of those women from the Renaissance, she's the daughter of a Sforza, Duke of Milan, illegitimate. She is the wife of the nephew of Pope Sixtus IV, so she's in the Sistine Chapel, who's a horrible person. She gets married to a Medici. She will end up being the grandmother of the first Grand Duke of Tuscany. She has an affair with a stable boy, but we'll just leave that aside. She goes up against the Borgias. So here we are. These are all names that we all know, right? Medici, Borgia, Sforza. These are all famous names. And she's not a wallflower. 90% of the time when you read about these women, they're just kind of like standing in the corner. And she must have been sitting in the corner doing her knitting and her embroidery. And maybe she saw this and maybe she saw that. This was a protagonist. This was a woman who, when Cesare Borgia came to take her stuff, she said, over my dead body. This is a woman who lived with an abusive father, an abusive husband, and managed to keep going. So to me, she's an extraordinary figure of resilience, really this powerful figure of a woman who saw things, who engaged with her world, who had the confidence in herself to be able to make huge mistakes. She makes wild mistakes, but did not give up and just kept going. And to me, actually, I think the most moving part is when she's imprisoned by Cesare Borgia, and she's subjected to, imagine being the prisoner of Cesare Borgia after you've managed to outsmart him a couple of times. I'm sure that was not a pleasant experience, and we know enough to know that it certainly wasn't. But this time that she is to spend in prison at the Castel Sant'Angelo is the Jubilee year of 1500. So, from these windows, she's watching the stream of pilgrims. And at some point, her letters to this priest with whom she was communicating regularly, at some point, her letters change. And she starts talking about sort of unifying her suffering and offering up her suffering. So this tremendous ability for her from this depths of really disaster to find a spiritual strength to keep going. I admire her tremendously.
Very, very nice. Well, thank you, Liz, for your time. The last thing that remains for me is just to Well, to advertise your tours, obviously, your vast knowledge that you've just also kind of given us evidence for anybody that ever comes to Rome to contact you. You did talk about that you have a new company now, Lislev Tours, which I hope it will be very successful and you'll reach even more people as you already are doing. And then I can suggest to everybody to do their homework and read at least one of your many books. So thanks for your time, and I hope that we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, John. It was great.